Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast, where we answer key questions in dating, relationships, success, and fulfillment, and explore the psychology of masculinity. Now, here's your host, world-renowned therapist and life coach, David Tian.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast. I'm David Tian, your host. This episode is going to be a little different. This is an analysis that is using the Batman movie starring Robert Pattinson that came out in 2022, directed by Matt Ridley. It's not going to be a full review by any means. I'm simply using it as a springboard to draw attention to some really important, key, necessary, essential psychological concepts and themes that are important for everyone, I believe, to understand, because those are the key to understanding their lives in the modern world and finding happiness and fulfillment and love and worthiness. And I'll be covering four big themes: the themes of the false self. I'll also be looking at the root of all evil. I put it that way just so it's easier to remember, the root of all evil. I'll be covering the power of the inner child and why the inner child work is a gateway to further growth, is a necessary phase of growth. And the fourth point is looking at the shadow. And we're going to be looking at the real shadow. It's not the shadow that you probably would think it is. Why these 4 points? Because they are the key to understanding yourself. If you don't understand these concepts and themes and you just uncritically, naively, like a child, adopt the value system that is on the surface of most superhero stories, but especially Batman and many of the DC stories, then you'll miss the truth of the matter, but you're even more dangerously or damaging, you're going to imbibe a set of values that will prevent you from finding self-worth, true self-worth, and happiness and love or lasting fulfillment. So, without further ado, let's get into the Batman. But before we go any further, big spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, go and watch it. I watched it just a few days ago, so I'm recording this fresh, but I record these episodes a few weeks before they're released. I try to anyway, and I'm trying to keep it relevant here. But part of it means that I've only seen it once, so I know that if I saw it again, I'd pick up a lot more, but I know I won't have time for the next at least 3 weeks before I could see it again, so I am going to record it now, and therefore not a full review, but I will be referencing plot points that are spoilers. So if you haven't watched it yet, pause it here, go watch it, and then come back to this episode. It will make a lot more sense, obviously, and you'll enjoy the movie a lot more. Also, big caveat, I am not a comic book aficionado. I poked around before recording this on various platforms to look for reviews of the Batman movie, and a lot of these reviews were referencing, to me, arcane facts about various plot lines or timelines or versions of the Batman. And they were very informative, giving the context to understand what Matt Ridley is doing here with this particular Batman. But I've only watched the Batman movies, and when I was like 11 years old, for, 6 months or so, I was really into the comics. But then I ended up choosing Dungeons & Dragons and spending my allowance money on that instead. So this is not a detailed breakdown or review of the actual movie. There's tons of those online. This is using the Batman movie as a springboard and as a case study for understanding those 4 points that I mentioned and for deepening our own understanding of ourselves. Okay, so here we go. Spoiler alert. If you still haven't paused this, in case you haven't watched it yet, spoiler alert's coming up. Okay, so this episode, I'm going to be drawing attention to lots of points that show that Batman should not be psychological ideal, right? It should not be what we would call a narcissistic ideal. It should not be your ideal. However, of course, growing up, watching and reading Batman as a young boy, of course it would be an ideal. And along with Superman and all these other superheroes, and I love superhero movies especially. I just don't have the time to read the comics, but I'm sure if I got into those, I would love them too. And I am going to, in a way, attack this sacred cow. And I'm going to be pointing out how the Batman character, especially in this Matt Ridley depiction of Batman this year, 2022, I loved it the most. So I'm going to just full out just tell you whether I liked it. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs up, big thumbs up for me, because I love the grittiness and the realism. The storyline, the setup, the character is a lot more believable and realistic than any other Batman movie depiction I've seen. And I really appreciated that. I also it's important to realize that this is the beginning of apparently a trilogy that Ridley is going to be releasing. So I didn't know that until I watched these reviews on it. So that put it into context too. So we're seeing a relatively young Batman who's 2 years into his journey as Batman. And I thought it was a really deep psychological depiction of a Batman who is burdened and troubled and in pain and hurting and fearful. And to a certain extent, I saw the same burdens and troubles and pain and hurt and fear in all of the Batman depictions, though what's frustrating is often you see a more mature Batman who's sort of one-dimensional, and it's just not realistic from a psychological point of view. This was the most realistic one. There was also realism in the sense that this Batman didn't go apparently through a hero's journey before becoming Batman, versus what you see in Christopher Nolan's Batman depicted by Christian Bale, which I loved, totally loved that trilogy. But I watched those before I had a deeper understanding of psychotherapy several years ago, more than a decade ago, I suppose. And I would like to rewatch those at some point, though it'd be tough to find the time. But I love them as entertainment. And I love this movie as entertainment. It was beautifully shot. And just from an entertainment perspective, I found it incredibly gripping, much more so than I expected. I was expecting, when they announced Robert Pattinson's casting as Batman, I kind of recoiled because I saw as a skinny, a thin, kind of depressing vampire. And I thought he did really well in this particular Batman because the depiction was of a character who, at this stage in his journey, was still very much looking for revenge and was very angry. And anyway, I'll get into that. But I love this grittiness to it. And in this Batman, you see the clearest depiction of his burdens that he's carrying and the fear that they actually discuss in the script, in the dialogue. And you see this also in Christopher Nolan's Batman and in other versions of Batman. But in Nolan's Batman, he went through this whole hero's journey at the beginning, the first movie, through the League of Shadows and Ra's al Ghul and all of that. And that explained how that Batman developed all of these ninja skills. But this one, in Matt Ridley's Robert Pattinson version of Batman, apparently he just learned his fighting from Alfred, who was an intelligence officer. And that explains also why he's not a perfect fighter. He gets hit a bunch of times, and it's a lot more realistic. And I really appreciated that. That was a really cool part of the entertaining aspect of this particular movie. And the psychological elements were most at the fore of any of the Batman movies I've seen. So I'm going to take advantage of that and use this as a springboard to discuss those. And I've got 4 that I pulled out, though when I first made my brainstorming list, there were over a dozen, but I just don't have the time. So I picked the 4 most salient ones. And here we go. The first one is on the false self. And the clearest depiction of this in the dialogue is when Batman finally confronts Riddler face to face in Arkham Asylum, and Riddler says something along the lines of, "This is the real you, not the you behind the mask, but this Batman is the real you, just as this Riddler, this is the real me, and whatever alias, like his real name, isn't the real him." And there's a perfect depiction of what a false self actually is. So if let's take Riddler as an example. If Riddler saw himself, his true self saw the Riddler persona of his as just a persona, then it wouldn't be a false self. It would just be a part of him. Just as you might have a part of you that comes out when you're on the basketball court and you're like a beast, or a part of you that comes out when you're playing with your 3-year-old niece and you're a really playful uncle or something. And there's a part of you that you are in the boardroom at work. And those are all perfectly fine parts of you if they're happy in their roles, and they only turn into a false self when the part itself, like the Riddler part, or other parts make the Riddler part into the true self, right? This is the real you, when in fact, obviously it's not the real him, but they desperately hope that it's the real them because of shame. So in Riddler's case, it's obvious, the toxic shame, that he's ashamed of how he is in day-to-day life on the streets, his normal self. I guess we call him Edward, I think his name's Nashton. So the Edward Nashton and his day-to-day persona, which was not noticed, not getting love, not getting his needs met. And out of shame about his unworthiness, he created, or out of that pain, arose this other part of him, the Riddler. And out of that toxic shame, his desperate belief is, and hope, is that this is now his real self, the real him. And I've done many seminars and episodes, and I've put this in Rock Solid Relationships and Invincible, my courses, on the false self, because this is a common pattern for men who are trying to get better with women, that instead of giving love to and being there for their more vulnerable parts and meeting the needs of their more vulnerable parts themselves as their higher self, instead of doing the healing therapeutic work, they instead create or bring up a false, a part of them that they hope is the true them, the real you. And then it becomes a false self. It's false in the sense of it's not your true self, but it's been thrust into the role of the true self, or has taken it or usurped the role of the true self out of shame as a reaction to the shameful parts, and hoping that the shameful parts will go away because there's not the real you anymore, those shameful parts. And this is the biggest theme and the biggest danger to imbibing superhero values or superhero ethics or superhero psychology, which is that the Batman is superior to the wounded boy, or the Riddler is more worthy than Edward Nashton, or the true Edward Nashton, or the wounded Edward Nashton. And to get rid of the wounded boys in you, or the wounded inner child, the move here is to destroy it, to get rid of it, to exile it, in IFS therapy terminology, and instead put this other part in the position of the true self. And that's why we, from our more objective perspective from the outside, we can label it as a false self. And then all of the literature, the research literature around narcissistic personality disorders, psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, the cluster B disorders, it's easier to make sense of because they use this dichotomy between original self and false self. And it actually can fit into the much richer, more complex analysis of IFS therapy. So the false self is a part that's either usurped the role of the true self and exiled the shameful parts, or the parts that, from its perspective, are shameful, or it's been thrust into that role by other parts and has accepted this role. And here the Riddler is trying to do that to Batman and saying, hey, this Batman, I can tell, is the real you. And in the movie, it largely is. And just like the butler, Alfred, keeps telling Bruce Wayne, the Bruce Wayne character, that he ought to actually be Bruce Wayne, as Bruce Wayne go out in public. And Bruce Wayne is empty in this movie. He hasn't created the Bruce Wayne of Wayne Enterprises persona, that the Playboy persona, or even the businessman persona. And as a result, they've just been spending money creating weapons and all of this and burning through the budget, apparently. And he hasn't stepped into that other persona, but that's also as a persona. And if I were his therapist, I would be helping to just separate out all of these various parts of him, the Batman part, and there are multiple Batman parts, and then later on, when he creates the Bruce Wayne personas, to make sure that those are kept clear and that he's very aware of those and has a good relationship with those two, so that the more you individuate and get clear and get to know each of these parts, the more room there is for Bruce Wayne's true self to emerge. Though I have not seen a good depiction of that happening in the Bruce Wayne character. So moving out away from the Riddler, so just that I thought that was a really great dialogue point there of the real you, bringing in an explicit way this distinction between the false self and other parts of you, and of course versus your true self. And then you can see that the Batman is an extreme protector. So the canonical version of things is around 8 years old. Bruce Wayne saw his parents killed in front of him in the alleyway. I'm not sure if that's actually the story they're going with in the Riddler trilogy. But there's some kind of traumatic event. As a result of dealing with that pain, he learns how to fight and just starts trolling the streets at night with sort of vengeance as, anger as revenge as his motivation. So first it's exacting vengeance out of this anger, not knowing where to put it, and this anger channeling it into revenge against the evil or bad elements at night in the shadows. He is not just in the shadows, he is the shadow, something I'll be getting back to in point 4. But then you notice that as the movie goes on, you start to see what is the anger starts to transmute into another motivation, or there's been another motivation alongside it all along. And you'll see that the Batman is an extreme achiever as well, but in a kind of firefighter. So firefighter is a category of parts in IFS therapy. It's a very extreme protector that arises out of a reaction to triggering, and triggering as a result of some kind of trauma. And the Batman can be seen as a kind of extreme protector, and there are even deeper, even more extreme protectors in the Batman that you see towards the end of the movie, where he just loses it because of the adrenaline shot he took, or that venom or whatever it was that he took to wake himself up at the end, and he just pummels this guy. He just goes in rage. So there are even more extreme versions of the protector part. But the Batman as an extreme protector arising out of trauma, and first in this movie, you're seeing the first stage of it as anger. But then there's also a deep desire to save, to not just exact his anger with no other good out of it. The motivation is to save somebody else. And it doesn't take much deep psychotherapy to understand that what he's really trying to reenact is trying to save his parents. But he cannot do that. And so he's reenacting the trauma every night, going out in hunt of the guys who killed, or the evil ones who killed his loved ones, and then re-scripting it for him every night, but in a way that's haunting and gives him no peace. So anger is revenge, morphing into, with underlying it, a desire to save his parents who represent good. And you start that, the first scene starts with that, right? So he's fighting the bad boys, the bad guys, letting the ones go that are, on the fence, and then saving the innocent one who, the victim, is actually afraid of Batman and seeing this anger. Right? So as guys, you might also notice that when the extreme protector comes in, you might think that you'd be rewarded because you saved the woman from some evil threat. But then when you turn towards her still angry and still with that, obviously in the Batman, he still looks very menacing and intimidating and scary, right? But even with that, coming with that anger, if you use anger as a fuel to beat up the bad guy, and then you turn to your wife or your daughter, don't expect them to embrace you right away, because the fear is that can turn on them if they're not careful. So it was very realistic that this innocent person was afraid at first. This is a good segue into just pointing out that being a crime fighter and doing lots of good and defending against evildoers is awesome. That's why I watched this movie. That's why I'm a big fan of the Batman character. And you're rooting for him the whole time, right? And it's awesome. But what as a therapist now, I'm feeling in this character, and every time I think back to other Batman movies I've watched, there's a compassion for this person who needs a therapist very badly. And it's that he's fueled, especially in this movie early on, right, 2 years into his journey, he's fueled by anger and fueled by revenge. And there is clearly a redemptive cycle here. He's trying to live out the pain and the trauma to actually save the ones he loves, and cannot do that. And so he takes this sort of minor version of it as a kind of solve for his wounds, but they never actually, because he never is able to meet the needs of the wounded inner child because he's exiled him and refuses to go there. But in this movie, there's a move towards it, which is beautiful. As a result of that, his good acts are fueled by a kind of self-righteous anger, and it doesn't feel good to do that. You can still stop evil and do good and save others, save the innocent, without needing all of that extra energy of anger and rage, because that certainly is a fuel. but it is a fuel that's toxic and burns you up inside and burns you out much faster and is not enjoyable. And even just in fighting, like if the fighter gets angry and loses it in the middle of the cage or in the middle of the fight, he starts to get sloppy. You can see it sometimes, right? And versus the fighter who is keeping his cool, keeping his breathing under control, and is kind of detached in a way because he's able to see the punches coming, to see the strikes coming in, and to see what the other opponent's doing. Time starts to slow down because he's in flow. And you're not going to get into flow in an effective way, in a skillful way, if you're driven by rage or anger or vengeance. And that's what you see at the beginning of this movie, and I thought it was very realistic. Ironically, I've been calling the type of achiever part or pleaser part who tries to save, fix, rescue others as a way of getting the worthiness of getting the love. I've been calling that the white knight. And in this case, it's the dark knight, but the dark knight is a white knight. And dark knight is an extreme white knight. And there's another character who's an extreme white knight, Catwoman. And I just don't have time to get into that, but that's another white knight, and it's paralleling, and they have chemistry, but ultimately they can't stay together because they're both white knights. Anyway, there is a point I wanted to bring up. Mr. Rogers, in I think it was the 80s, campaigning against superhero movies when the first Superman movies came out, and kids were, I think 1 or 2 kids, put on a Superman cape and tried to fly and then died, something along those lines. Don't quote me on that, but I didn't have time to research that fully. But as a result, he had produced a lot of content to tell children that they don't need to be a superhero in order to be worthy of love, and that they're just fine the way they are. I mean, they're just as worthy and valued for love, just the way they are, without having to achieve. Now, I've done a lot of episodes about how people get so messed up about what real value is and what real worth is. So some people look down on that or attack Mr. Rogers' theme, misunderstanding him. He's not saying you're going to be worthy of money or a job or something like that if you don't do anything to earn the money in the job. What he's saying is he's talking about worthiness of love, these deep core insecurities that you're not good enough unless you save others. Okay, so that's a non-extreme protector who just does it for worthiness. This more extreme protector is doing it out of pain, out of anger, out of revenge, as a deeper desire to save because of the more extreme trauma as an 8-year-old seeing his parents slain in front of him. But that Mr. Rogers' message is even more pertinent here. And then just one other thing that I was thinking of when I was watching the movie, and that struck me when I watched the recent Spider-Man movie, the one where there was a crossover, like the multiverse one with Doctor Strange. And one of the remarks that Doctor Strange gave to Spider-Man was, these problems are coming up for you because of your bifurcated identity, because you insist on keeping this a secret. And that was a really good call out, because right from the beginning, the first Marvel Universe movie of Iron Man, at the end of it, he says, "I am Iron Man," which is a huge move from Batman, because at the end of this Batman, another reason I love this movie, the end of this Batman, the Riddler keeps saying to him, Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne. And I totally thought that he knew. And then that was like a weird plot twist there. And then that he didn't do anything with that knowledge. But then I realized from the reviews I watched that he actually said later on, and then I realized that was the case, that he was just saying Bruce Wayne is the one that got away. Big spoiler there. But anyway, you'll notice that he clings to that this two-faced nature of it, this false self, right? So as a result of that, insistence on the false self and different personas kept completely separate, there is a prevention of integration, of psychological integration. What makes the MCU journey for Tony Stark so wonderful to watch, because he goes through this pretty big character arc, is because he begins right with that first movie, facing the shadow and the false self and beginning that integration process. And as a result, he comes into his own and becomes the king, really, against all odds, because he was really not a kingly character. And anyway, that is not going to be on the MCU. But that Spider-Man Doctor Strange And Doctor Strange, of course, is not hiding behind any kind of... I mean, that was a joke running through the movies that Spider-Man thought Doctor Strange was a moniker or an alias, but it's in fact just his name. And that was a much more powerful, ballsy alpha. And of course, I'm saying those words because they will appeal to men. But of course, a more psychologically integrated move on Doctor Strange's part, not to live out a persona or false self. Now, there are all kinds of practical reasons for it. I totally get it, as you can tell with the Spider-Man thing. And is a minor and all this. He doesn't have the means and so forth. But part of the fallout for the Spider-Man and for Batman and for many of the DC characters is this bifurcated identity and the shadow, the hidden, the shame of it, having to keep a secret identity. And the psychological burden of it is not healthy and will actually prevent psychological integration and healthy ordering and balance and harmony of his inner parts. Do you struggle in your interactions with women or in your intimate relationship? Are fear, shame, or neediness sabotaging your relationships or attractiveness? In my Platinum Partnership Program, you'll discover how to transform your psychological issues, improve your success with women, and uncover your true self. Get access to all my current and future online courses by applying for the Platinum Partnership today at davidtianphd.com/platinum. Okay, so the second theme is looking at the root of all evil. And you see this at the beginning of the movie. And right at the beginning, the Batman got this voiceover and he's talking about how he's not in the shadows, he is the shadow, and how he uses fear to control the evil. The fear is his greatest weapon. So the fear, right from the beginning, it's a great theme. And then it comes to bite him in the ass later because we learn that the fear is what actually is driving him, not even the anger itself. The fear of it happening again, the fear of losing someone I care about. As you see in those rare moments of vulnerability when Alfred is in the hospital, he's sitting with him there and he's, finally is opening up and Alfred reaches out his hand and then they hold hands. And then he sees the bat signal and boom, false self has, well, for Batman, it's not quite the false self yet, right? It is for Riddler, but not for Batman yet. But it's on the way. He's on the cusp of it. And luckily, towards the end of the movie, he pulls back from that. And it's a beautiful thing to see where he's playing with discovery of his true self. Who's the true self? And he still hasn't found it, of course, and very few superheroes have. And returning to the fear, the fear of it happening again is what drives him to go out and reenact the trauma in a way to save it from happening again. And really his greatest fear is of losing someone he loves or cares about. And you see this, so I'm going to now quickly move to the third point. You see this in the way the Pattinson character looks at the mayor's son repeatedly. And maybe that was a little bit too heavy-handed. I don't know. To me, it was like all the time. It was like, wow, this is a pretty strong leitmotif here. But it is a great segue to point 3, which is the inner child. The reason, kind of the gateway to his salvation, to his healing, to Batman's healing in this movie is actually the mayor's son, because he sees in the mayor's son, obviously reflected his own inner child that he is exiled as a result of, well, the decision he made to exile that inner child, the pained, wounded one. And instead, the firefighter, the extreme protector, arises and trolls the streets at night looking for people, innocent ones, to save from bad guys. And in a kind of haunted, burdened, troubled, pained, hurting way, all fueled ultimately by fear. This is why the foundational question in most of the IFS therapy process, the foundational question is, once you get to know a part, you ask the part, what is it that you're afraid might happen if you were to stop doing this job that you're doing? To ask the Batman when you're sitting in your therapy room and you access Batman and you ask the Batman, or one of the Batmans, the one that's trolling the streets and maybe a dominant Batman, what are you afraid might happen if you didn't do your job? And there you will find the things that, and you probably just come up with some surface level thing. You just keep asking this same question 3 or 4 times to get to the real root fears. And ultimately it will be, if he's being vulnerable as he was in Alfred's hospital room, the fear of it happening again. the fear of losing someone he loves. And he's preventing that from happening, the fear of it happening again and losing someone he loves, by reenacting and what we call redoing, rescripting the trauma event. The inner child, and coming to, so the defensive mechanism, the coping mechanism with the trauma was to become Batman. That's obvious, right? And the healing is to stop the coping long enough to discover the vulnerable inner child within and go to this part, get to know it, hear everything it wants to share with you, and see everything, witness everything it wants to share with you, and then to go through this unburdening process for the inner child. And once the inner child parts, especially the 8-year-old who saw his parents get killed in the alleyway, is unburdened, and this will, for something that traumatic, might take multiple unburdenings, unburdening various beliefs that he took on at the time or emotions and letting go of those and giving them up to the elements and so on. And that is the healing process. Once the vulnerable inner child part is released of its burdens and is no longer haunted by fear and shame and anger and unworthiness, and most importantly, fear. And of course, the beautiful sadness that he would obviously be feeling. It's called beautiful sadness because it's an empowering sadness, because the sadness itself is healing in the presence of your true self, your higher self. Okay, so I'm just sort of previewing the healing process. This is something that you would need to go through the therapeutic process to experience, either with a good IFS therapist in private or through some of my recorded courses like Freedom U, the therapeutic ones like Freedom U, Rock Solid Relationships, Lifestyle Mastery, Invincible. Even Invincible has inner child healing processes embedded in it. And throughout the movie, you can see him coming out of being driven by anger or revenge and instead moving into an empathy and compassion and having that motivate the same actions. And that feels a lot better, by the way, if you haven't experienced that you could do good, not fueled by self-righteous anger, but fueled instead by compassion. And he does that in a few different places in the movie. And then at the end, the big transformative point in the movie is him being with the mayor's son as he's being hoisted up into the air. And now you can understand how this child was the conduit, the gateway for the Batman to encounter his own inner child. And for very driven ultra achievers, it's very difficult to access your own inner child parts directly. So often the way that it can happen, and it happened for me, as I've shared in a video on my YouTube channel that's like currently on the homepage, that I call The True Meaning of Life. And I share the story of how I discovered my inner child parts, used with my goddaughter, my young goddaughter, as a proxy and gateway for that. And you can see the same parallel process happening for the Batman character in this movie. So the final point I wanted to bring up is the real shadow. Where is the real shadow? So at the beginning of the movie, Batman says, "I am not in the shadows, I am the shadow." And it's really cool to think of Batman as a shadow. It makes sense. Batman is a shadow. But the real shadow are actually the villains. The shadows of the society are the villains. And just like with our own shadows, we will not have any peace or harmony without going to the shadows courageously and confronting them with, and learning about them, seeing them, understanding their hurts, their pain, and what needs they have that are not being met, and then meeting those needs, meeting those emotional needs for them, first and foremost being compassion and listening to them and just bringing your presence. And instead, if you were to further exile them, guess what's going to happen? These were exiled shadows, of course, in the villains in this movie, Riddler and his gang of incels, basically. I don't know the term for it, but there were 500 fans he had on some shadowy social media or some kind of forum, community forum online. And a whole bunch of them showed up with rifles and were going to exact revenge on the people that ignored them, that caused them hurt, that did not see or understand them before. And their way of doing this versus, Batman was similar. I mean, that was the whole point, that Batman is just like them in many ways, depending on how you see it. It's all relative, right? And he was also vengeance, and they are also vengeance. And he did it through crime fighting and saving innocent people, and they're doing it through chaos, through killing, and mostly through chaos. And they have chaos in a community. And those are two really important aspects that one of the things that they're really looking for is community, because in a community, they are seen and understood. And as a result, their needs for connection are met and their needs for significance. And now they're going to collectively get even more significance by causing chaos. And then finally, people will know their names, so to speak, right? And all of this is exactly what our shadow parts do when they're not attended to, and you can't actually exile them for long. This repression will eat away at you from the inside, just as the self of society, the shadow eats away at it on the fringes and then from the inside. And in case you think, maybe I don't have a shadow like this, this is exactly the hero arc that boys grow up with. I grew up with it, and it's toxic. This is toxic masculinity. Again, not all masculinity is toxic. But this, what I'm going to share with you, and what you see in the villains in this movie, and the Batman character is unwittingly, unconsciously skirting with, is what we as boys buy into as a lie. It's a lie about what will actually make us feel significance and get us self-worth. And it's a lie that's perpetuated in all kinds of media. And I remember seeing it in one of the iconic forms in this famous copywriting advertisement, the insult that made a man out of Mac. And I went and looked for it online as just to give you the comic version of there was originally a comic that is an advertisement for Charles Atlas's fitness program. And this advertisement was placed in a lot of comic books in the 70s and earlier. And it was also the same plot line. You see this in one of the Christopher Reeves Superman movies. And this is just the plot line of dudes that they're living out this narcissistic fantasy without realizing it. And it's being supported and promoted by pop media because they know that it's eating away at your core insecurities, and you'll buy stuff as a result of them triggering those core insecurities in men. Okay, so I'll read out the comic. The insult that made a man out of Mac. Hey, quit kicking that sand in our faces, says the guy, the skinny guy. And then the girl in the bikini that he's next to, I guess on a date, says, that man is the worst nuisance on the beach. And it's this bigger guy kicking sand in their faces. Next frame. The bigger guy grabs the skinnier Mac and grabs him by the arm and says, listen here, I'd smash your face, ... Only you're so skinny you might dry up and blow away. And then the next frame. The bully is gone, and now the skinny Mac is there with his girlfriend, or the girl he's dating in the bikini. And he says, the big bully, I'll get even someday. The girl says, oh, don't let it bother you, little boy. Okay, so that'll eat away at the core insecurities of masculinity for boys, young boys. And then he's at home now, dressed in his street clothes, and he kicks the stuff in his room and says, darn it, I'm sick and tired of being a scarecrow. Charles Atlas says he can give me a real body, all right. I'll gamble a stamp and get his free book. And then the next frame, the last frame says, later. And then now he's looking in the mirror, and he's this big buff guy in a Speedo, basically. And he says to himself, looking in the mirror, boy, it didn't take Atlas long to do this for me. What muscles! That bully won't shove me around again. And then next to it is a photo of Charles Atlas, the real life figure here, awarded, and says, awarded the title of the world's most perfectly developed man. And this advertisement did so well that it ran for over a decade, and it still appeared. I think I Googled that the last appearance of it was in 1997, but it was already all over the comics in the 70s. And it taps into the insecurities that boys have around their masculinity, and it feeds them a lie that if they become a false self, then they'll get all of the things that they've been yearning for. Not just that they'll get muscles and a six-pack, and maybe a better fitness level and better health, which is what, in fact, that those things will give them. But even more, it will give him psychological and emotional gifts and value that he's really yearning for, because he's not really just getting the muscles or doing the workout for however long it will take for a skinny guy to become that buff, which is definitely more than a few weeks, or definitely more than later, as it shows in the comic book. For him to do all that, he's going to go through a lot of hard work to become that. And then he has to maintain that. And maintaining it often means continuing to grow. And all of this really is being driven by a core and deep insecurity that he's not man enough, and that if he's not man enough, he won't get the girl. And if he doesn't get the girl, then he's not worthy. He's not worthy of not just sex and pleasure, but not worthy ultimately of existing, of being someone who is worthy of love or significance. And if you can tap into those much deeper core insecurities, these guys will buy whatever you give them. And unfortunately, this ad did really, really well. This is also the time that Mr. Rogers was putting out content. And it is this great counterpoint to the Charles Atlas ads, that toxic messaging that you have to overcompensate for perceived weaknesses by being, whatever it is that you think is necessary. Often it's some tough guy or whatever, so that you can finally be worthy of the woman or whatever. And so it's not just a self-defense move or something like that. It is a psychological and emotional move to toughen yourself up in the hopes that you are now going to be worthy. And I've addressed why that is so toxic. I've addressed that in many other episodes. But it's a great counterbalance or counterpoint, to Mr. Rogers' messaging, and really the messaging of all good psychotherapy, which is that you are worthy of love just the way you are. And if you want to get big muscles, or if you want to learn self-defense, then by all means go for it. But don't be under the illusion that those things will make you more worthy of love. They'll get you whatever they get you: more money, safety, whatever it is, better health, bigger muscles might be intrinsically valuable. You can lift more stuff. I don't know. And if you enjoy the process, or if you want it badly enough because it'll help you get something that you want and you enjoy it, then by all means do it. Just like if there's nothing wrong, of course, with what the Batman character is doing of defending innocent people and protecting against bad guys and all of that. And that's, one reason why on the surface it's so easy to love and root for this character. But ultimately, if you look below the surface, you can see the motivations of what are actually driving the Batman character, and what's driving the deep insecurities, these deep insecurities that are driving even in the Mac comic book, the comic strip, driving him to get the body of Charles Atlas so that no bullies will push him around anymore, and finally the girl will like him. Not realizing, of course, that any girl who likes him as a result of that, what he wants is actually connection and love, not just sex. But any girl who wants him just because he's buff now, he'll always lose out. And that's not actually love, and it's not actually valuing him for who he is, but for what he has or for what he can do, rather than for who he is. And just as Mac created a false self at the end of that comic strip, the Batman created a part of him that arose as a result of, in response to deep pain and anger and deep sadness, and ultimately mostly of fear, the fear of it happening again, the fear of losing someone he loves or cares about. And to prevent that from ever happening again, never again, says this part, he trolls the streets at night looking for a way to reenact and save the innocent people in hopes that this will solve his wounds. But those actions cannot do that. The only thing that can actually do this in a permanent way, in a lasting way, is true healing, not compensating for it, not compensating for the pain and the fear through this tortured existence, through this tortured protective work. So ultimately, this Batman movie is a great depiction of real life, which you wouldn't expect to find in a superhero movie. So I highly recommend it to everyone. Just as a recap of the four main points, the first one being that you see a great depiction of the false self. And ironically, the Dark Knight is a white knight, and the Batman is an extreme protector, and so is the Catwoman. And that this bifurcated identity, that you see also the tension between, the difference between Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, and that came up in that movie, is all a manifestation of the problems of adopting a false self. And ultimately, Riddler did really have a false self. I'm not saying that I hope I didn't say that the Batman is a false self, but the Batman could become a false self, that the Batman part could become a false self. But of course, the Batman part and parts are extreme protectors of the little boy at 8 years old who was traumatized. Second point being fear. Fear is the root of all evil. And Fear is what ultimately is driving these Batman parts to do what they do. The third point is that the way to healing is through the inner child and healing the inner child. Because once the inner child parts are healed and unburdened, the ones protecting the inner child parts realize that they don't need to protect them anymore. And so they're not tortured or driven by fear any longer. And now they can move into more healthy roles. And it might still be fighting crime and protecting the innocent, but they won't do it through this haunted, tortured way. And then finally, noticing that the villains in this movie are actually the real shadow of society, not the Batman. And that what they need, just like all shadow parts need, is to be seen and understood, to be brought out of the shadows, seen and understood, embraced and given compassion, because that's actually what they're looking for, community, to be seen and understood, and to have their hurt and pain seen and understood. And then they will be on their path to unburdening. By the way, if you liked this analysis, I highly recommend Richard Schwartz's book, No Bad Parts, that goes through these themes of the shadow, the villain, in different terminology, of course, purely IFS therapy terminology. Highly recommend that book, No Bad Parts. And I hope that you have derived some deeper understanding of yourself, or maybe of society, and if nothing else, at least of the Batman movie. And that I recommend that you go see the Batman movie. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. I am also just a person putting out my thoughts and ideas and analysis of these things. I'd love to hear yours. So please give me some feedback. And thank you so much for the support and feedback I've gotten already. And I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian, signing out.